There is a smell that Victorian women knew and dreaded more than almost anything else. It is not the smell of the tannery or the workhouse or the cholera ward. It is something quieter than that, subtler. It is the smell of pennyroyal boiling in a tin pot on a back kitchen fire, the sharp medicinal green of it rising through a two-room tenement in Whitechapel or Bermondsey, or Bethnal Green, while outside the children play in the gutter and the husband is somewhere else entirely, and a woman stands over that pot with her hands on the side of it and counts, very carefully, how many weeks it has been since she last bled. That smell, that counting, that stillness before the decision, that is where we're going tonight. Not into the grand hospitals with their marble floors and their eminent surgeons, not into the drawing rooms where respectable women discussed female complaints in whispers behind gloved hands. We're going somewhere much smaller than that. We're going into the back kitchens and the rented rooms and the darkened parlours of ordinary women, women who work themselves half to death every day, and still could not make the numbers come right. Women for whom another pregnancy was not an inconvenience but a catastrophe. Women who broke the law. Women who risked their lives. Women who helped each other, quietly, in the particular silence that women kept among themselves when men and the law and the church couldn't be trusted with the truth. We are going back to Victorian England, to the 1870s and 1880s, when Britain sat at the centre of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, when the Great Exhibition was still a recent memory, and the railways had stitched the country together, and Queen Victoria's photograph hung in 1,000,000 parlours, and also in those same years, when a woman could be prosecuted, imprisoned, transported, or killed for making one particular decision about her own body. This is not a comfortable story. I want to be honest with you about that up front. But it is a true one, and the women in it were real. Their desperation was real. Their courage was real. The things that happened to them were real. So get comfortable, or as comfortable as this one gets. Here we go. You have not slept properly in 4 nights. It is not the usual sleeplessness, not the kind that comes from the children waking, or from the noise in the street below, or from the cold that seeps through the single thin blanket you share with James, who is sleeping now with his mouth slightly open and his arm thrown out across the mattress in that particular way he has, as though even in sleep he is claiming the space. You have learned to sleep around that arm. You have learned to sleep around most things. This is different. This is the sleeplessness of someone doing arithmetic. You lie in the dark and you count. You've been counting for 4 nights. Not shillings and pence, though God knows you count those too, but weeks. 6 weeks. 6 weeks and 3 days since you last bled, and you know your body well enough, after everything, to know what that means. You've been pregnant before, 4 times. You know the particular quality of this tiredness, the way your breasts ache when you turn over, the way you cannot stand the smell of the fat Mrs. Hartley renders down on Tuesdays, the way your mouth fills with something metallic and wrong when you try to eat porridge in the mornings. You know. You have known for nearly 2 weeks now, but knowing and admitting are different things, and you've been existing in the gap between them, hoping that your body would prove you wrong, that the blood would come, that you would feel the familiar low cramp and wake to find the sheet stained and everything all right again. But the blood has not come. Your body is not going to prove you wrong. James shifts in his sleep. The mattress dips under his weight. You hold yourself very still. The arithmetic goes like this. You earn 4 shillings and 6pence a week doing piecework, stitching shirt collars at the table in the front room while the children are sleeping, or while Annie, who is 7, keeps Robbie occupied on the landing. The collars are 3p for 3 dozen. You can do maybe 6 dozen on a good day, if the light is reasonable and nobody needs feeding and the thread doesn't tangle. 6 dozen is 6p. You do not always have good days. James brings in what he can, which depends entirely on whether there is labouring work at the docks and whether he goes to find it rather than stopping at the Rose and Crown on the way, which is not a certainty you would stake money on. The rent is 3 shillings and 6p a week for these 2 rooms. That is 3 shillings and 6p that has to come in before anything else, before food, before coal, before the penny a week you put aside for the doctor's club, though you have not been able to put aside that penny for the last 2 months, and you are already frightened about what happens when one of the children falls sick. Annie and Robbie eat. Robbie is 4 years old and he eats like something feral and inexhaustible. Annie is 7 and she eats less, but her shoes have worn through at the toe, and you have stuffed the gap with a piece of cardboard that gets wet every time it rains, which is most of the time, which is England, which is your life. You have 2 children now. You had 4 pregnancies. You cannot have another. You cannot. The numbers do not allow it. If you stop working for even 2 months, the rent does not get paid. If you stop working for 4 months, which is how long you were unable to sit at the collar work after Robbie, you lose the rooms. If you lose the rooms, you are in the workhouse. If you're in the workhouse, James will drink himself to death in a month, and the children will grow up in the casual ward, learning the particular education of children who have nothing, which is to say, they will learn how to survive by becoming unrecognisable versions of themselves. You cannot have another child, and yet you lie in the dark and you listen to your husband breathing, and you think about what you know and what you don't know and what you're going to have to do and who might help you do it. And the arithmetic keeps running, the same figures cycling through your head, the way the wheels of a cart go round in mud, going nowhere, just turning. Outside on the street someone is shouting. A drunk, probably, or a fight. The sounds of Bermondsey at midnight are a particular education. You know the sound of the knocker-upper at 4:30 in the morning. You know the sound of the night soil men who come at 2 when the street is quietest. The scrape of their buckets on the flagstones. You know every creak of this building, this 4-storey tenement on Grange Walk where 32 people share a single standpipe in the yard, and the privy at the bottom is used by all of them, and is never quite clean, and is one of the reasons Robbie has had the runs twice this winter. You know everything about surviving in this particular square of London. What you don't know is where to start. In the morning, you get up before James wakes. This is the first rule. You get up before James wakes, because if James wakes and you are still in bed, he will think you are ill, and if he thinks you are ill, he will ask questions, and there are no answers you can give him right now. James knows there have been difficulties before. He does not know how those difficulties were managed, and he is not going to find out, not because you think he would be violent about it, though you're not entirely certain of that either, but because James would tell someone, or let it slip at the Rose and Crown, and that is a rope you cannot afford to have placed around your neck. The Offences Against the Person Act. You know those words. Mrs. Partridge downstairs said them once, very quietly 3 years ago, when she was in the same situation you're in now, and you understood then what they meant without her having to explain, the same way women in your street understand all the things that are said quietly in doorways and across backyard walls. Life imprisonment. That is what the Act says, for the person who performs the act, and for the woman herself up to 3 years with hard labour, for procuring your own miscarriage. That is the law of England as it stands in 1878. That is the law Victoria's Parliament wrote and Victoria's Queen signed and Victoria's judges enforce. You splash water on your face from the basin. The water is cold. It is always cold. The room is cold. The whole of this building is cold until May, and there are currently 6 weeks until May. And in the meantime the coal cost 1.50 per hundredweight, and you are already behind. You look at yourself in the small piece of mirror James salvaged from somewhere, God knows where. It is propped on the windowsill and the glass is slightly foxed so that your face appears to swim when you look at it. 28 years old. Brown hair that has not been properly washed in 2 weeks, because washing your hair requires heating water, and heating water requires coal. Eyes that people used to call pretty. A face that people used to call lively. You look at that face and you make a decision. You are going to fix this. You do not yet know how, but you are going to fix it. The first thing you do is what every woman does first, because it is free and because maybe it will work. You go to Mrs. Cole at the chemist on Tooley Street, not to ask outright. You would never ask outright. You go to ask for something for your nerves, you say. Something for the tiredness, the irregularity, the female weakness. And Mrs. Cole, who is a stout woman with grey hair and a permanently knowing expression, looks at you for a moment with those eyes of hers that have seen 30 years of women coming in for female weakness and nervous troubles, and she reaches under the counter without asking any further questions, and she puts a small brown bottle on the counter. Pennyroyal pills, the label says, for the relief of obstructions, 12 for 3p. Obstructions, that is the word. In Victorian England, the delicate vocabulary of women's medicine is entirely constructed around this one euphemism, obstruction. The natural flow stopped, the regularity disrupted. You're not pregnant. You're obstructed. You put 3p on the counter. You put the bottle in your pocket. You walk home with it pressing against your hip through the thin fabric of your dress. This small brown bottle that is simultaneously a medicine and a crime, depending on your circumstances and what a jury can be made to believe about your intentions. You take the pills that evening, 2 of them, as the label says, then 2 more the next morning. They taste of something sharp and herbal and faintly medicinal, and they give you cramps that bend you double over the collar work for an hour, and then the cramps subside and nothing else happens. Nothing else happens. This is where the arithmetic changes and the problem gets harder. Pennyroyal. Let me tell you about pennyroyal. It is a plant. Mentha pelagium. It has been used by women since at least the ancient Romans, who were very clear about what it was for, in a way the Victorians distinctly were not. It belongs to the same family as ordinary kitchen mint, and you can grow it in a window box, and you can buy it dried at the herb stall in the market for a halfpenny, and women have been making tea from it for 2,000 years, and using that tea for exactly what you are trying to use those pills for. Does it work? Sometimes, at very early stages, in high doses. The active compound, pulegone, is toxic in large quantities, which is the mechanism by which it might cause a miscarriage. It poisons the body slightly, stresses it, can cause uterine contractions, but the dose required to reliably end a pregnancy is close to the dose that causes serious liver damage in the woman taking it. The line between medicine and poison is very thin here. The pills Mrs. Cole sold you contain a mild extract, mild enough to be sold openly, mild enough to be legally ambiguous, which means, in most cases, mild enough to not work. You know this, somewhere underneath the hoping. You have heard enough from Mrs. Partridge and from Mrs. Keene, who lives on the second floor, and from the quiet conversations that happen between women who trust each other, to know that pills alone are rarely enough. But you had to try. You try the hot bath next. This requires more calculation. Heating enough water to fill even a quarter of a tin bath requires a fire, and a fire requires coal, and you're already behind on coal, and the effort of carrying water from the standpipe in the yard up 2 flights of stairs is significant when you are 28 and tired, and your body's already doing things without your permission. But you do it. You heat the water as hot as you can stand, and you get in, and you stay in until the water is no longer hot, and your skin is pink all over, and the steam has made the small bathroom, which is not actually a bathroom, but a corner of the kitchen partitioned off with a piece of board, feel like the interior of a laundryman's copper. Nothing happens. You get out. You dry yourself with the rag that serves as a towel. You go back to the collars. You try gin. Gin is the specific medicine recommended in the particular whisper network of working-class women for situations like yours. 2 glasses of gin, as hot as you can get it with hot water taken quickly. The logic is the same as the bath. Heat and alcohol combined, the body shocked into expelling what it is holding. You have also heard, though you're not sure you believe this, that drinking gin while taking a hot bath simultaneously is more effective. This combination would require gin and coal at the same time, which represents a significant financial outlay. And also it seems to you that sitting in a bath drinking gin is the kind of thing that could end with you unconscious face down in the cooling water, and you have 2 children who need you to not drown. You take the gin without the bath. 3 glasses, hot, in the evening after James is at the Rose and Crown. You have bought the gin by telling James you needed turpentine for a cleaning job, which required a certain creative arithmetic of your own, since turpentine and gin from the off-licence are not quite the same price, but you manage it. The gin makes you vomit. It also makes you cry, which you do very quietly with your face in the basin, because you do not want to wake the children. Nothing else happens. Here is what you are beginning to understand, though you do not want to understand it. The remedies that women can obtain for themselves, the pills and the herbs and the hot baths and the gin, these work best sometimes at the very earliest stages, in the first 2 or 3 weeks, when the pregnancy is so new that any serious insult to the body might dislodge it. You are 6 weeks in. You are past that window. What you need now is something more direct, which means what you need now is someone who knows what to do, which means you need to find her. The network of women who help women in your situation is not something that exists on paper anywhere. It is not listed in any directory. There is no advertisement. There is no address you can look up. It exists entirely in the space between women, in whispered conversations and meaningful looks, and the particular way certain information passes from person to person when everyone involved understands the stakes. You start carefully with Mrs. Partridge. Mrs. Partridge is 53 years old, and she has lived in this building for 11 years, and she has seen everything. She lost her husband to a railway accident in 1869, and since then she is managed by taking in washing and by being the particular kind of woman who knows things, which is a kind of social capital that costs nothing and is worth a great deal. She is also the woman who, 3 years ago, said those words to you quietly, the words about the act, and you understood then that she was telling you something without telling you, which is the Victorian woman's primary mode of communicating anything that matters. You go to her on a Wednesday morning when James is at the docks and the children are both out. You go on the pretext of borrowing a flat iron, and you drink the tea she offers, and you do not say anything for a long time, and she does not say anything either, and then she refills your cup and she looks at you, and you look at her, and you say, "I think I need some help with a female difficulty." And she is quiet for another moment, and then she says a name. I am not going to tell you that name yet. Let me tell you instead a little bit about the world you both inhabit. The world that has created this conversation, this quiet Wednesday morning in Bermondsey, 1878. These two women drinking tea and speaking in euphemisms about a crime. There are 3.5 million people in London in 1878. It is the largest city in the world. It is also the most unequal. The distance between the Duke of Westminster's estates in Mayfair and the rooms you're sitting in now is about 3 miles, as a bird flies, and approximately the width of the universe as a measure of what each place contains. The Duke has more money than some sovereign nations. You have 4 shillings and 6pence a week, and 2 children and a husband who drinks, and now this other thing pressing against the inside of your ribs like a fist. The law says you cannot do what you're about to try to do, but the law was written by men who had never had to do the arithmetic you're doing, men for whom another child meant another heir, or at worst another expense that could be managed by the existence of estates and incomes, men who understood female virtue as a category of property law, rather than as something a living woman might have complicated feelings about, men who voted in Parliament, which women could not do, to pass laws governing women's bodies, which women could not contest. The law says, you must carry this pregnancy to term. The law does not say, and here is how you will feed the resulting child. The law does not say, and here is who will pay the rent when you cannot work. The law does not say, and here is the mechanism by which James will contribute consistently instead of drinking, and here is the solution to the shoes with the cardboard in the toe, and here is the guarantee that this child, if born, will not die before its 2nd birthday, the way the first 2 did in that fever winter of 1872, that winter you do not think about directly, because the shape of it will unmake you if you let it. The law says no, and the law does not offer an alternative, and the law does not live in this building. You live in this building. In 1878, the birth rate in England and Wales is around 35 births per 1,000 population. The death rate for children under 5 is, in working class areas of London, catastrophically high. Almost a third of children born to working class families in Bermondsey and Suffolk and Whitechapel will not survive to see their 5th birthday. They will die of diphtheria and scarlet fever and typhoid and the measles and the particular London chest diseases that fill tiny lungs with fluid and take them in a night. They will die because there is not enough food, and the water is not clean, and the rooms are too cold and too damp and too full of people, and the doctors cost money that does not exist. Women know this. Women do the arithmetic. And so, in those same years, tens of thousands of women in Britain are doing exactly what you are doing, seeking to prevent a birth that the mathematics of their lives cannot accommodate. The number of illegal abortions taking place in Victorian Britain is impossible to know with certainty. The nature of the act prohibits documentation, but historians who have studied the period, looking at the patterns of prosecution and the records of hospitals and the testimony of midwives and the accounts of women who survived and occasionally wrote about what they survived, estimate that the numbers are significant. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands perhaps each year across the country in back kitchens and rented rooms with penny herbs and pennyroyal and worse things than that. This is not an aberration. This is a feature, and the women who help them. Let me tell you about the women who help. They are, for the most part, not the grasping criminal operators that newspaper accounts of the period sometimes suggest. They are, in most cases, women who've been midwives, or who have learned from midwives, or who have simply accumulated, over years of living in proximity to other women's desperate situations, the knowledge of what can be done and how to do it with the minimum damage to the person seeking help. They are working-class women helping working-class women. They charge money because they need money, and because the risk they are taking has a price, but they are not typically getting rich. They are running a significant legal risk for fees that sometimes amount to a few shillings. They are also sometimes the difference between a woman who survives and a woman who does not. The name Mrs. Partridge gives you is Mrs. Garvey. She lives in a court off the Old Kent Road. She takes in plain sewing as her visible trade. She is, says Mrs. Partridge, very careful, and she has helped several women that Mrs. Partridge knows, and none of them have come to grief, and you should go to her on a Thursday morning between 9 and 12, and you should say that Mrs. Partridge sent you, and you should bring what money you have. How much money, you ask? Mrs. Partridge looks at her hands. 1/2 crown, she says. Maybe 3 shillings. 1/2 crown is 2 shillings and 6pence. 3 shillings is 3 shillings. These are not enormous sums in the abstract. In your life they represent somewhere between half a week and 3/4 of a week of collar work, or 100 weight of coal, or 3 weeks of the Doctor's Club penny. You nod. You thank her. You take the flat iron you ostensibly came to borrow and you go back upstairs and you sit at your table and you look at the collars waiting to be stitched and you calculate how many extra dozens you need to do this week without James noticing that the money isn't where it usually is, and then you pick up your needle and you start to stitch. The Thursday is 4 days away. 4 days is not a long time. But when you're counting, 4 days is 4 days. Let me tell you about other women while you wait. While you're stitching collars in Bermondsey, in a very different part of London, a woman named Clara Beresford is attending a musical evening at a house in Kensington. Clara is 22 years old. She is the daughter of a solicitor in Exeter. She came to London 8 months ago to stay with her aunt and attend the season, and be, in the specific language of her class, introduced. She's pretty enough for this purpose. She plays the piano tolerably well. She has a pleasant, if undistinguished, manner. She is also 10 weeks pregnant. The father is a man named Frederick Ashton, who is barrister's clerk and who was considerably charming at a number of social engagements over the autumn, and who is now, since Clara made the mistake of telling him, considerably absent. He has not replied to her last 3 letters. He's not going to reply to them. Clara's situation is, in the mathematics of her class, entirely different from yours, and also, underneath those differences, exactly the same. She cannot have this child. If she has this child unmarried, her life, as she and her family understand it, is effectively over. She will not be introduced to any more eligible men. She will not have the season she came for. She will not inherit what her father's careful middle-class accumulation was intended to provide her with. She will be, in the language that her circle uses without embarrassment, ruined. The consequences of ruin for a woman of Clara's class are not the same as the consequences of an additional child for a woman of yours. They are differently catastrophic, but they are catastrophic nonetheless. Ruin means exclusion from respectable society. Ruin means her parents' shame, which is the specific Victorian currency of social death. Ruin means she becomes what is called, in the genteel euphemism of the period, a fallen woman, which is a category so permanent and so total that even the language of sin contains within it the impossibility of rising again. Clara does not go to a woman like Mrs. Garvey. Clara's aunt, who understands the situation without being told in full, speaks quietly to her own physician, Dr. Hargreaves. Dr. Hargreaves is a man of the world in the particular way that men of the world are. He has practices that are invisible to the respectable public. He attends several women of his acquaintance in similar circumstances, and he does not do it for free, and the fee is a different order of magnitude from what you are going to bring to the court off the Old Kent Road. For 4 guineas, paid in cash, Dr. Hargreaves will manage Clara's difficulty. The procedure he uses is not, from a technical standpoint, so different from what Mrs. Garvey will use on you. The difference is in the cleanliness of the instruments. The difference is in the quality of the room and the competence of the hands and the availability of attention if something goes wrong. The difference is everything, and the difference is money. Dr. Hargreaves will not be prosecuted. His patients are women with connections, women whose fathers and brothers are solicitors and barristers, and men who know other men. The law that sent women and their helpers to hard labour in Victorian England was enforced primarily against women of the working class and against the women who helped them. The Claras of the world disappeared into private nursing homes and emerged, after a discrete period, ready to resume their introduction to society. The women of Bermondsey and Whitechapel and Bethnal Green went, when things went wrong, to hospital, where they sometimes died and sometimes were prosecuted from their deathbeds, and sometimes both. This is the Victorian justice system as it applies to women's bodies. It is not perhaps surprising. It is no less enraging for being predictable. Thursday morning comes. You leave Annie in charge of Robbie, which you can do because Annie is 7 and Robbie is 4, and Annie is already, in the way of working-class eldest children, considerably more competent than most adults give her credit for. You tell her you are going to see about some work. She does not believe you, but she does not say so. Annie is already, at 7, a keeper of necessary silences. The walk to the Old Kent Road takes about 20 minutes. You know this part of London. You have walked it 100 times. To the market, to the suppliers who take the collar work, to the doctor's surgery when Robbie had the croup last winter. But you have not walked it feeling the way you feel this morning, which is a particular combination of nauseous and terrified and grimly determined that, once you have felt it, you never quite forget. Your hands in their thin gloves are cold. The morning air smells of coal smoke and the particular early morning smell of the river, which is tidal and low at this hour, exposing the mud banks with their cargo of everything London discards. Broken pottery, dead cats, the occasional object you try not to identify. The court Mrs. Partridge sent you to is accessed through a narrow passage between 2 buildings, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. A child is sitting on the step at the entrance, playing with a stick and some pebbles. He looks at you as you come through the passage and looks away again with the incurious gaze of a child who sees things passing and understands that most of what passes is not his business. The court itself is small, a square of grey stone with buildings on 3 sides and a shared drain in the centre that is not draining particularly well this morning. Washing is strung between the upper windows. The smell is of coal smoke and damp and something else underneath, organic and complex, which is simply the smell of a great many people living in very close proximity and managing their needs with inadequate facilities. Number 4 is on the left. The door is plain wood, slightly warped. The step is swept. You knock. You wait. Inside you can hear movement, the sound of footsteps. Then the door opens. Mrs. Garvey is not what you expected. This is the first thing you notice, and you notice it because you have been constructing her in your imagination for 4 days. The way you construct things when you are anxious, imprecise, oversized, full of fearful projection. You expected someone formidable, large, professionally frightening. She's small. She's probably 60 or thereabouts. Her hair is almost entirely white, neatly pinned, and she's wearing an apron that has been washed and pressed this morning. Her hands are visible at her sides, and they are the hands of someone who's done physical work for many decades. Strong, slightly knotted at the knuckles, the fingernails clean and cut short. She has grey eyes, and the kind of face that has expressed and processed a great deal of emotion over a long life, and arrived, on the other side, at something that is not hardness, but is adjacent to it. She looks at you. She looks at you with those grey eyes in a way that is direct and appraising, but not unkind. "Mrs. Partridge sent me," you say. She steps back from the door. You go in. The front room of Mrs. Garvey's house is entirely ordinary. A table, 2 chairs, a fire that is laid but not lit, a shelf with a Bible and a few other volumes on it, and a small framed picture of the kind that is sold at the market. A rural scene, sheep, a church in the distance. Pieces of plain sewing folded on the table. Everything clean, everything in its place. Nothing about this room suggests anything except a respectable widow managing modest circumstances. She tells you to sit down. She sits across from you. She looks at you for a moment. "How far along?" she asks. This is not a conversation about obstructions. Not here. Not between 2 women who know precisely what is being discussed. The relief of not having to use the euphemism is physical. You feel it in your shoulders. 6 weeks, you say, maybe 7. She nods. This is good, her nod says, or at least manageable. The longer you wait, the more complicated this becomes. You have not waited too long. She asks you some questions, medical questions, in the practical, unadorned way of someone who has been asking them for a long time and who is not a doctor but who knows what she needs to know. Has your health been generally good? Are there any conditions she should know about? Have you had difficulties before? In previous pregnancies or confinements? You answer carefully. There were 2 miscarriages, early ones, in between Annie and the pregnancy that ended in Robbie. And she nods at this information as though it is relevant, as though she's filing it somewhere. She tells you what she will do. I will tell you too, because this is a history episode, and the history is real, and you should know it. In 1878, the most common methods available to women who helped other women in these circumstances depended on a combination of botanical knowledge, physical intervention, and luck. The botanical options had largely been exhausted in your case. The pennyroyal had not worked, and the gin had not worked, and you both know it. What Mrs. Garvey has available in the back room of her house is a knowledge of the female body accumulated over 30 years of attending women in confinement and in difficulty. She has certain instruments which she keeps clean and which she heats before use in a spirit lamp, which is better than most and better than you will find in some of the other houses you might have gone to, of which there are others in this city, some of whom Mrs. Partridge would not recommend. She has a tin of slippery elm bark, which is important. She has ergot of rye, which is the dried fungus that grows on rye grain, and which causes uterine contractions, which has been used in midwifery for 100 years as a last resort to stimulate a stalled labour, and which, in smaller doses, in earlier pregnancies, has the same effect for different purposes. She has her own 2 hands. She tells you it will hurt. She tells you this with the directness of someone who respects you enough not to lie about it. She tells you it will be over quickly, and then there will be cramping, sometimes for a day or 2, and you should go home and rest as much as you can. And if you bleed more than is normal for a heavy monthly, or if you develop a fever, you must come back to her immediately. And she tells you this last part with a particular emphasis that tells you she has said it before, and has had it not be heeded, and has not forgotten the times it was not heeded. You nod. You take out your money, which you have saved in the lining of your coat, 2 shillings and 9 pence, because that is what you have managed in 4 days of extra collar work without James noticing. It is not quite half a crown. She looks at the money. She takes it without commenting on the amount. She tells you to come through to the back room. The back room is different from the front. It is very clean. The floor has been recently scrubbed. You can smell the soap. There is a narrow bed against one wall, covered with a clean cloth, and a small table beside it on which there are various items arranged with care. A spirit lamp, already lit and warming, a basin, cloths, a few glass bottles. The window is small and high and gives little light, but there is a candle beside the lamp. The room smells of carbolic soap and something herbal, and the particular clean mineral smell of very recently scrubbed stone. She has you take off your outer skirt and your petticoat, which you do with your back to her, your fingers stiff with the morning cold and with something else, some state that is not quite fear, because fear would be too simple a name for it. That is fear and grief and determination, and the arithmetic, still the arithmetic, cycling through your head. She is not unkind. She's not warm in the way that some women are warm, the soft, reassuring warmth of your mother or of Mrs. Partridge. She does not offer platitudes or false comfort, but she is calm, and in the particular circumstances, calm is worth more than warmth. Calm is information. Calm tells you that she has done this before, and that it is manageable, and that she intends for you to leave this room upright and intact and able to return to your children. You lie down on the narrow bed. She works quickly. The slippery elm bark is her first tool, prepared and inserted, and you grip the edges of the bed, and you breathe, and you make no noise because there are other rooms in this house, and because you are, at the deepest level of your being, a woman who has learned to manage pain silently, in the way that women in your situation learn to manage it, because there has never been the option to make noise about it. There has only ever been the option to continue. The cramps begin almost immediately, low and grinding, different from labour but related to it in some animal way your body recognises without your permission. She keeps her grey eyes on your face throughout. This is the thing you will remember afterward, that she watched you, that she did not look away, that she kept that gaze on you the whole time in a way that was, underneath everything, a form of witnessing. She was, for the few minutes this takes, entirely and only present to what was happening to you, and that is its own kind of care. It takes less time than you expected. She gives you the ergot, a small dose in water, to drink. Then she covers you with a cloth and tells you to lie still for 20 minutes. You lie on your back on the narrow bed, and you stare at the low ceiling and you breathe. Outside in the court, a child is shouting something. A door bangs. The ordinary sounds of Tuesday morning continue, entirely indifferent to everything. The cramps ebb and build and ebb. You do not cry. Not because you're not moved by this, but because you are somewhere beyond easy emotion, in the state that comes after the decision has been made and the thing has been started, and there is nothing left to do but endure the consequence of your own necessary choice. 20 minutes pass. She brings you a cup of tea, which is not something you expected. You drink it. It is plain and strong and hot, and it is perhaps the kindest thing you've been given in several days. She tells you what to watch for. She tells you that the process will continue over the next 24 to 48 hours. She tells you again, any fever, any hemorrhage beyond what is normal, you come back to her, or you go to the hospital. And she says this last part with a look that tells you that going to hospital would not be ideal for either of you, but that it is better than the alternative. You get dressed. You smooth your skirts. You pick up your gloves from where they have been sitting on the chair by the door, and you put them on, and you feel the slight rawness of your palms from where you gripped the edge of the bed, and you look at Mrs. Garvey. "Thank you," you say. She nods. There is something in her face at that moment, something that might be sadness, but might be something else, something less legible. Perhaps just the particular expression of a woman who has done this work for 30 years, and has seen many women walk through that door and has never stopped understanding what it means that they have to. You walk out of the court. You walk back down the passage. The child is still sitting on the step with his stick and his pebbles. He doesn't look up this time. You walk home. The cramps come in waves on the walk back. You stop twice. Once to lean against a wall and breathe through it. Once because your vision goes slightly grey at the edges for a moment, and you need to hold on to the iron railing of a front garden to let it pass. This last occasion coincides exactly with a woman walking past who glances at you with the incurious glance of a city person managing their own errands, and then walks on. No one stops. No one asks. In London in 1878, a woman leaning against a railing looking pale is, with respect to the population of people who might offer assistance, entirely alone. This is fine. You do not want assistance. You want to get home. You get home. Annie is at the table with Robbie, feeding him something from a bowl that is, from the look of it, mostly bread and hot water. She looks up when you come in. She's 7 years old, and she has her grandmother's eyes, which are dark and sharp and see more than is comfortable. She looks at you in that particular way she has, and she does not ask any questions. "I brought some bread," you say, which is true. You stopped at the baker's on the way, spent a halfpenny you didn't have, but the ordinary domestic transaction of bread felt, in that moment, essential, felt like evidence of something, normalcy maybe, or continuity. You put the bread on the table, you sit down, you pick up the collar work, you stitch. The cramps continue through the afternoon and into the evening. James comes home and you have food ready, which you have managed by the specific effort of will that women in your situation apply to ordinary tasks while managing extraordinary ones simultaneously. And he eats and talks about something that happened at the docks and asks whether Robbie's cough is better and goes out again at 7:30. By 9 o'clock you are fairly certain that what you went to Mrs. Garvey for is beginning to work. By midnight, you know. You are awake in the dark again, but this time the arithmetic is different. This time the numbers are adding up correctly. This time, when you count back from the rent and forward from the collar work, it comes out to something survivable, not comfortable, not anything you would wish for yourself or for the children, but survivable, the tight, grinding mathematics of survival, which is a kind of solution even if it is not a solution you would have chosen. Outside, The night soil men are making their rounds. You can hear the scrape of their buckets in the street below. The ordinary, endless sounds of a city managing its own necessary functions in the dark. You fall asleep. Now, I want to tell you about what happened to women when Mrs. Garvey, or whoever their Mrs. Garvey was, could not be reached, or was not found in time, or made an error, or worked in less careful conditions. Because this is also the history. The hospitals of Victorian London kept records of a kind. The records are incomplete, because medicine in 1878 is not yet the systematically documented practice it will become in a century's time, and because there was, among hospital staff, a certain reluctance to record cases in ways that would raise uncomfortable questions about patients and about institutions. But the records that do exist tell a particular story. Women came to the hospitals, working class women, mostly. They came in the night sometimes, brought by husbands or neighbours or sisters. They came alone sometimes, walking themselves through the dark streets in a state that their bodies were not designed to sustain. They came in various stages of what the medical notes called, in the delicate Victorian vocabulary, irregular hemorrhage, or puerperal fever, or septic infection. They came because something had gone wrong. The something that went wrong was, in almost all cases, infection. This is the terrible mathematics of pre-antiseptic medicine. The germ theory of disease is known in 1878. Lister's work on antisepsis is known. Pasteur's work is known, but the knowledge has not yet fully transformed the practice of surgery and medical intervention, and the instruments used in the back kitchens and rented rooms of London are sterilised, if at all, with variable competence and variable understanding of why sterilisation matters. Even in Mrs. Garvey's clean room with her spirit lamp, the gap between the standard of asepsis she can achieve and what would be required to eliminate infection risk entirely is significant. The women who came to hospital came with fever. They came with a particular kind of fever that the medical staff recognised, and that was called by various names in the literature of the period: puerperal peritonitis, septic metritis, general septicemia. These are different words for the same process, which is infection entering the bloodstream through damaged internal tissue and spreading through the body with a speed that, in the absence of antibiotics, is frequently fatal. At Guy's Hospital, a 10-minute walk from Mrs. Garvey's court, the records from the 1870s include a number of cases of women admitted in states consistent with incomplete or improperly performed attempts to end pregnancies. The medical notes use the language of the time. The attending physician notes symptoms and applies treatment, which in this era consists primarily of rest, cold compresses for the fever, attempts to manage the hemorrhage, and laudanum for the pain. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes women recovered, sometimes they did not, and when they did not, and when the attending physician had reason to believe that the cause of the woman's condition was what they delicately called a criminal attempt to produce abortion, the law created a specific and particularly cruel situation. The dying woman became legally a witness to a crime and could be questioned on her deathbed, and her dying declarations could be taken and used as evidence, and were, in a number of recorded cases, used to prosecute the women who had helped her. Think about that for a moment. A woman is dying. She is dying of an infection that she would not have if the circumstances of her life had been different, if there had been adequate contraception, or if her husband had used it, or if her employment had been sufficient, or if the law had permitted her to make different choices earlier and more safely. She's lying in a hospital bed in pain, and she is dying, and the physician who is treating her is also, by law, in a position of having to report what he knows or suspects to the relevant authority, and the relevant authority may send a magistrate to take her statement, and her statement may be used, after her death, to put the woman who tried to help her in prison. This happened. It happened enough times that it was not considered unusual within the medical establishment of the period. There are recorded cases from the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s in which magistrates attended hospital wards and took dying declarations from women in extremis. The women, in some recorded cases, refused to give names. In others, they gave names. In others still, they were too ill to speak coherently, and the declarations were taken from fragments and reconstructed into something that could be used. The woman who was prosecuted on the basis of such evidence was not Dr. Hargreaves. It was never Dr. Hargreaves. There is a case from 1879, 1 year after the Thursday morning in Mrs. Garvey's back room, that I want to tell you about because it is the kind of case that was not unusual, and because it tells you something specific about the relationship between the law and the women who were subject to it. A woman named Elizabeth Thornton, a midwife in Shoreditch, was prosecuted under the Offences Against the Person Act, following the death of a woman named Sarah Kemp, who'd been admitted to the London hospital with septic infection, following what the coroner's inquest determined to be an instrumental abortion. Sarah Kemp was 24 years old. She had 2 children. She'd been a costermonger's wife. She died 11 days after her admission. Before she died, she named Elizabeth Thornton as the person who had helped her. Elizabeth Thornton was tried at the Old Bailey in October 1879. She was found guilty. She was sentenced to 5 years penal servitude. She was 61 years old. She had been a midwife for 27 years. The judge in sentencing spoke about the terrible crime of those who profited from the desperation of poor women. He spoke about the importance of the law in protecting the sanctity of life. He spoke about the particular heinousness of a woman who used the trust placed in her by other women in their time of vulnerability and turned it to criminal purpose. He did not speak about why Sarah Kemp had needed help. He did not speak about the conditions that produced women like Sarah Kemp or like Elizabeth Thornton. He did not speak about contraception or about poverty or about the specific mathematics of working-class life in Shoreditch in 1879. These things were not part of the legal question before him. He sentenced Elizabeth Thornton to 5 years, and the court moved on to other business. Sarah Kemp was buried in the churchyard of St. Leonard's, Shoreditch, in a part of the yard that was not particularly close to the more respectable graves. She had no headstone. The money had run out before that was possible, and besides, there was a certain ambiguity about what you would put on the stone of a woman who had died of a criminal abortion, even if everyone privately understood that she had simply been trying to manage the impossible arithmetic of her life. Her 2 children were taken into the care of the Board of Guardians and placed in the workhouse. Let me step back for a moment, because you are listening to this and you are presumably comfortable, and you are probably not in the immediate situation of the women I'm describing, and I want to give you a sense of scale, a sense of how large this history is, because what I have been describing so far is the story of 1 woman in Bermondsey, and 1 woman in Shoreditch, and 1 woman in Kensington. And I want you to understand that these individual stories are taking place against a background of something much larger. There are, in 1878, approximately 26 million women in England and Wales. Of those women, the vast majority are married or will be married. Marriage in Victorian England, for working-class women especially, means regular sexual intercourse with no reliable means of contraception, because the contraception that exists is either expensive, unreliable, or dependent on male cooperation, which is not always forthcoming. James, in our story, would not have used a condom even if condoms were readily available, which they are not, because that is not how James thinks about these things. That is not how most men of his time and class think about these things. The question of whether to risk pregnancy is not understood as a question that James participates in answering. So women get pregnant, regularly, repeatedly, and the arithmetic of their lives dictates for many of them that they cannot manage what these pregnancies produce. The births happen, the children arrive, and then the children die, in the significant numbers that children die in Victorian London, or they survive and require feeding and housing and clothing that the mathematics of working class wages cannot always provide. The women who try to interrupt this cycle are making a calculation, not a trivial one, not an easy one. They are weighing the harm of continuation against the risk of intervention, and they are making that calculation in circumstances where all the options are bad and some are catastrophic, and the law offers no guidance except prohibition. The estimated number of criminal abortions in England and Wales in the 1870s and 1880s is, depending on which historian you read and which methodology they use, somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 per year. The range is large because the evidence is fragmentary, but the lower end of that range represents in a decade 500,000 women making the decision you made in that back room on the Old Kent Road. The upper end represents 2 million. 2 million women in a single decade risking prosecution, infection and death to manage what their bodies were doing. This is not, I want to be clear, a small or marginal aspect of Victorian life. This is a central feature of it. This is happening quietly and continuously in the back kitchens and the rented rooms and the private nursing homes, while the Victorians are building their empire and their railways and their exhibitions and their great public institutions, while they're writing their novels about virtue and their sermons about the sanctity of the family. In the back rooms of the city, women are doing arithmetic, and the women who are helping them are learning, through hard experience, what works and what doesn't, and what is likely to kill someone and what might not. Which brings me to the question of the remedies, and the question of what safe means when nothing is actually safe. The methods available in 1878 exist on a spectrum from relatively low risk to extremely high risk, and the risk is always compounded by two factors: how late in the pregnancy the intervention is attempted, and how clean the conditions in which it happens. The botanical methods, the pennyroyal, the savin oil derived from the juniper berry, the oil of tansy, the black hellebore, these are at the lower end of the risk spectrum, but also at the lower end of the efficacy spectrum, particularly after the earliest weeks. They can cause cramping. They can, in high doses, be acutely toxic. Oil of savin and oil of tansy are both poisonous in quantities large enough to be effective as abortifacients, and there are recorded deaths in the Victorian period of women who self-administered these substances in quantities that they hoped would work and that in fact killed them. The line between effective and fatal with these compounds is not one that most women had the botanical education to navigate accurately. The lead-based preparations are in a category of their own. Diachylon, a lead-containing plaster that was also sold as a remedy for various female complaints, was used by some women and by some of those who helped them. Lead is a uterine stimulant in certain circumstances, and it is also a systemic poison, and women who use diachylon regularly, or who used it in large quantities attempting to end a pregnancy, face the additional risk of lead poisoning on top of everything else. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, which include abdominal pain, constipation, weakness, neurological effects, were not always recognized as such by the women experiencing them or by the doctors who occasionally saw them. The instrumental methods, which are what Mrs. Garvey used, carry different risks. The risk here is not primarily toxicity, but infection and mechanical injury. An instrument introduced into the uterus can perforate it, in which case you have an internal wound that, without surgical intervention, will be fatal. It can fail to complete what it began, leaving a partial procedure that results in infection. It can introduce bacteria from the outside world into a cavity that is normally closed and protected, and those bacteria, without the antibiotics that do not yet exist, can proliferate until they reach the bloodstream, and then the whole body, and the body's response to this, the fever and the inflammation and the systemic reaction, is what kills women and what fills the wards at Guy's and the London and Bart's with these quiet, particular admissions. Mrs. Garvey is better than most. This is not nothing. Mrs. Garvey has 30 years of experience, and she heats her instruments and she uses clean cloths, and she knows when something has gone wrong, and she knows who to send a woman to when it has. She has developed, over those 30 years, a practice that, by the standards available to her, is as careful as she can make it. The women who find Mrs. Garvey through the particular whisper network of women who know women who need Mrs. Garvey are, compared to the women who find no one, or who find someone less careful, or who attempt to do something themselves in desperation, in a better position, not a safe position. There is no safe position in 1878 if you are a working-class woman with an unwanted pregnancy, but a better one. The women who attempt things themselves. Let me tell you about those women, because they are in the hospital records too, and their stories are among the most terrible of all. A woman alone, without money or connection, or the network that leads to a Mrs. Garvey, without anyone to ask, with a pregnancy advancing and options narrowing, facing what she faces, she improvises. She uses what she has, which is whatever knowledge she has absorbed from whispered conversations and from the general currency of women's information that circulates in the streets and the factory floors and the laundry rooms of Victorian England. She might use a piece of whalebone from an old corset. She might use a metal skewer, or a crochet hook, or a knitting needle, the latter of which appears so frequently in hospital records of the period that it becomes its own horrifying metonym for this particular desperation. She attempts to do, without training or instruments or the specific anatomical knowledge that even Mrs. Garvey has accumulated over decades, what Mrs. Garvey does in her scrubbed back room. The results are predictably worse. The hospital records speak for themselves, in the flat medical language of the time, admitted with symptoms of puerperal peritonitis following instrumental interference, or, in the rarer but existing cases where a patient is coherent enough to describe what happened, admitted having self-administered what appears to have been an attempt to procure miscarriage. The doctors who wrote these records are not, for the most part, cruel men. Some of them are visibly distressed by what they see. A physician named Dr. Arthur Wynne, at the Lying-in Hospital in Endell Street, wrote in a private letter in 1877 that he had attended 5 women in a single month who were suffering from the consequences of self-induced miscarriage, and that he found the cases both medically severe and, he chose the word carefully, morally ambiguous in ways that troubled him, in that he could not entirely disagree with the desperation that had produced the attempt even while he witnessed its consequences. Morally ambiguous, This is a Victorian doctor trying, within the available vocabulary of his time, to say something that his society did not have the language to say directly. That the law which prohibited what these women were attempting was producing more suffering than it was preventing, and that the suffering was not equally distributed, and that the women in his ward were paying, with their lives sometimes, for conditions and circumstances they had not chosen and could not change. He did not publish these reflections. They were in a private letter. He continued to attend his patients, and he continued to comply with his legal obligations, which included, when the situation required it, reporting what he believed to be criminal cases to the relevant authority. He was not a bad man. He was a man of his time operating within its constraints. But the letter exists, and it tells you something about the men who witnessed this history from the inside, who saw what the law produced when it met the reality of women's lives, and who understood what they saw but had no mechanism to say so. Now I want to tell you about a woman whose name I know, because she survived and eventually wrote something down, which is not the fate of most of the women in this history. Her name was Jane Martin. She was born in 1845 in a village in Shropshire, and she came to London in 1864 to work in a hat factory in Hackney. She married in 1867 a man named George Martin who worked in the printing trade. They had 3 children between 1868 and 1873. In 1875 she became pregnant again, which the surviving fragment of her account describes as the point at which she decided that she could not continue as things were going. She tried the pennyroyal. She tried a preparation her neighbour called the medicine, which from her description sounds like it may have contained tansy oil. Neither worked. She was by this point 8 weeks along. She found, through a chain of women she trusted, a person she describes only as a woman on Kingsland Road, who performed what Jane Martin calls in her account the intervention. She survived it. She survived the 2 subsequent days of severe cramping and significant bleeding. She survived the slight fever on the 3rd day that resolved on the 4th, without the hemorrhage that would have sent her to hospital. She recovered. She went back to work in the hat factory. She had no further pregnancies, which she attributes in her account partly to luck, and partly to a contraceptive arrangement, the nature of which she does not specify, but which she says she made with George, who was eventually persuaded of the necessity, though it took a season to persuade him. Whatever this arrangement was, it worked. Jane Martin wrote her account in a letter to a woman who was collecting testimonies for what would eventually become part of a broader campaign for women's access to birth control and reproductive health information, a campaign that would not produce meaningful legislative results in Britain until well into the 20th century. She gave her permission for the letter to be used under a false name in that campaign's literature. She said, at the end of her letter, "I do not know if what I did was a sin. I know that it was necessary. I know that the woman on Kingsland Road saved my life, in the sense that the life I had before that would not have continued if I had not made the choice I made. I have thought about it many times. I would make the same choice again. I think there must be hundreds of women who would say the same thing, if they were able to say it. Hundreds." She said hundreds, which is a woman of 1875 trying to express what is actually, if the historical estimates are even partially correct, an order of magnitude larger than that. But the impulse is right. The recognition that she was not alone in her decision, that her decision was part of something systemic and widespread, and fundamentally produced by conditions rather than by individual moral failing. That recognition is correct, and it is also more sophisticated than much of the public discourse of her time was prepared to be. Let me tell you about contraception, because you cannot talk about this history honestly without talking about what was available and what was not. Contraception in 1878 exists. It is not a recent invention. Condoms made of animal membrane have existed for centuries. Vulcanized rubber condoms, cheaper and more reliable than the membrane variety, have been available since the 1860s. Sponges soaked in vinegar or other substances has been used by women for longer than anyone has kept records. There are pessaries and douches and various preparations sold with the required euphemism as preventive checks or feminine hygiene preparations. They are available. What they are not is reliably accessible to working class women in 1878 for several reasons that interlock and reinforce each other. The first is money. A rubber condom costs about 2 shillings a dozen in the 1870s, which sounds cheap until you remember that 2 shillings is almost half a week's wages for collar work, and condoms are not a one-time purchase. Other preparations cost money too. Money that exists in the household budget only if something else does not also need to exist. The second is information. The Obscene Publications Act 1857 has created a legal environment in which distributing information about contraception is potentially criminal. The pioneering birth control advocates of the period, Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant, are prosecuted in 1877 for publishing a pamphlet containing contraceptive information, a prosecution that ultimately fails, but that demonstrates the legal precariousness of the information environment. Women who want to know what their options are have no reliable public source for that information. What they have is each other, and the variable and sometimes dangerously inaccurate knowledge that circulates through the same whisper networks that circulate information about Mrs. Garvey. The third is male cooperation. Even where contraception is available and affordable and both parties know what it is, its use depends on the agreement of both parties, and in Victorian marriage, where the sexual entitlements of husbands are enshrined in law. Marital rape is not a crime in England. A wife cannot legally refuse her husband's sexual demands. Male cooperation is not guaranteed. A husband who refuses to use a condom cannot be compelled to use one. A wife who insists faces consequences that may themselves be worse than pregnancy. This is the triptych that produces the back rooms and the Mrs. Garveys and the hospital admissions and the deathbed testimonies. Inadequate contraception, no legal reproductive options, and a law that criminalizes the inevitable result of those two conditions while doing nothing to address them. The medical establishment of the period is largely publicly committed to prohibition. The British Medical Journal and the Lancet publish articles throughout the 1870s and 1880s on the dangers of abortion, its moral dimensions, the importance of the profession's opposition to it. These articles are primarily written by men. They're primarily addressed to other men. The women who are the subject of the articles do not appear in them as agents with perspectives. They appear as victims of criminal operators, as women led astray by unscrupulous practitioners, as moral cases requiring correction. Occasionally a dissenting voice appears. Dr. James Aveling, writing in the 1870s on midwifery and the conditions of working-class women, touches on the desperation that produces attempts to end pregnancies and notes, carefully and in the qualified language of someone who knows what the professionally acceptable position is, that the conditions of poverty in which these attempts occur are themselves a medical and public health concern. He does not go as far as arguing for changed law. That would be too far, but he gets further than most. The feminists of the period, the first-wave feminists who are beginning to organise and publish and agitate for women's suffrage and property rights and access to education, have a complex relationship with this particular issue. The question of abortion is not, for most of them, a central campaign issue for tactical reasons. The strategic calculation is that demanding too many things simultaneously risks the suffrage campaign, which is the priority. There are also genuine differences of opinion within the feminist movement about how to frame the question of women's bodily autonomy in ways that will be persuasive to a Victorian audience. Some feminist writers of the period approach the question obliquely through the language of voluntary motherhood, which argues that women should have the right to refuse sexual intercourse with their husbands, and that this right is a more fundamental need than the right to any specific medical intervention. This is, in the social context of the 1870s, a radical enough position, but it is also, from the perspective of the women in the back rooms of Bermondsey, not immediately practical, because Jane Martin cannot retroactively decline what has already happened. Other writers, notably those associated with the emerging women's health movement, make more direct arguments about the relationship between poverty, inadequate contraception, and the incidence of criminal abortion, and call for more practical remedies. These writers are publishing in smaller venues, less prestigious ones, and their arguments reach a smaller audience, but they exist, and they are beginning to build the framework of arguments that will, a generation later, become the foundation of more successful campaigns. Let me step back into your specific life, into your specific rooms in Bermondsey for a moment. 3 weeks after the Thursday in Mrs. Garvey's back room, you are at the table doing collar work on a Saturday afternoon, when Annie brings you a cup of tea that she has made herself, carefully, on the small stove, because she is 7, and she has decided that this is something she can do, and she is going to do it. You take the cup. The tea is slightly too strong and slightly too sweet, because Annie has used a great deal of sugar, which you can't afford, because she wanted it to be nice. You drink it. It is very nice. She sits across from you at the table and picks up a piece of the collar work, mimicking the stitching motion. Not really sewing, but doing something that looks like it. That is a game of adult competence played by someone who is half made of adult competence already, and half still a child. You watch her. The dark, precise eyes, the careful hands, the particular quality of her attention. You think, she will not have the life I have. This is not a plan. It is not even quite a thought yet. It is something more fundamental than thought, something that sits underneath the arithmetic, underneath even the basic daily maintenance of survival. It is the reason the arithmetic matters. It is why the numbers have to come out right. If the numbers come out right, maybe Annie has options, not the options that Clara Beresford has, the Kensington Clara with her season and her piano and her physician uncle. That scale of option is not achievable from these rooms, but something. More than this. More than collar work at 4pence for 2 dozen. More than a husband who may or may not show up to work on any given day. More than this particular calculation of rent and coal and bread and the doctor's penny and will there be enough? Women make choices in the context of the lives they have and not in the context of the lives they wish they had. And this is so obvious as to be almost not worth saying, except that it is, apparently, frequently necessary to say it, because the people who make the laws do not always understand that the laws they make will be applied to the lives that actually exist rather than the lives that they imagine should exist. The collar work goes on. The tea gets cold. Annie abandons the pretend stitching and goes to see if Robbie is awake from his nap. You pick up a new collar, you stitch. The spring comes. The cold that has been living in the walls of the building since October begins very slowly to recede. The standpipe in the yard drips less when you touch it in the mornings. No longer frozen, only cold. The light through the small windows of the front room changes quality, becomes something thinner and more genuine than winter light, begins to carry information about the day in a way that winter light does not. April, May. The children go out more. Robbie's cough, which has been a present since November, slowly fades. Annie is still wearing the shoes with the cardboard in the toe, but you have put away threepence, and in 2 more weeks there will be sixpence. And sixpence is not new shoes, but it is the second-hand shoes at the market, which is something. James has been relatively reliable since February, which means he has been at the docks more days than he has not, which means there has been money coming in with greater regularity than usual, and you have been able to put aside a small amount each week in the lining of the coat. Not much, but something. Mrs. Partridge stops you in the yard one morning when you're both at the standpipe. "All right," she says. "All right," you say. This exchange between these 2 women at this standpipe contains an entire conversation in those 4 words. You both know it. She nods, fills her bucket, goes back inside. You fill yours. In the summer of 1878, a parliamentary committee begins examining the relationship between poverty and public health in the major cities of England. The committee will produce eventually a report that talks about infant mortality rates and housing conditions and sanitation. It will not, because it cannot, discuss the topic that underlies much of what it is examining, which is the relationship between unregulated fertility, poverty, and the specific mathematics of working-class women's lives. That particular question is not one that a Victorian parliamentary committee can ask openly, but the women know. The women have always known. The women in the back rooms and the court off the Old Kent Road, and the yards of the tenements of Bermondsey and Southwark, and Whitechapel and Stepney, have been doing this arithmetic for generations, longer than there have been parliamentary committees to examine them. Let me tell you about some of the things that are changing, or beginning to change, in this period. The Bradlaugh Besant trial of 1877, the prosecution for distributing contraceptive information, has an ironic effect. It publicises information about contraception. The pamphlet they were prosecuted for, Fruits of Philosophy, by the American physician Charles Knowlton, which had been circulating quietly for years with sales of a few hundred copies, suddenly sells 200,000 copies in the aftermath of the trial, because people are curious about what all the fuss is about. The prosecution, intended to suppress information, puts it on the front page. Annie Besant, who will go on to be a significant figure in numerous radical causes, begins writing and speaking more publicly about what she calls the arithmetic of poverty and the necessity of rational birth control. Her audiences are middle class in the main, not the women of Bermondsey, but the arguments she makes begin to circulate, begin to be discussed, begin to reach the doctors' letter writers and the parliamentary committee members who are, slowly and inadequately, trying to think about what is happening in the back rooms of the country. A woman named Henrietta Muller founds a journal called the Women's Penny Paper in 1888, a decade after your Thursday in Mrs. Garvey's court, which will be one of the first publications to address, directly and not entirely euphemistically, the relationship between women's health, reproductive control, and economic conditions. It publishes for several years to an audience that includes women who've been waiting for something that speaks to what their lives actually contain, rather than to what the Victorian model of femininity wishes their lives to contain. These are beginnings. They're not solutions. They will not become solutions in your lifetime or in Annie's or even in Annie's children's lifetimes, not fully. The Abortion Act in England and Wales does not pass until 1967. The road from 1878 to 1967 is 89 years long, and it runs through a great deal of suffering and prosecution, and hospital admissions and women dying in back rooms because the law preferred their deaths to their choices. But the beginnings are there. They are there in the letter Jane Martin wrote. They are there in Mrs. Garvey's scrubbed floor and spirit lamp. They are there in the parliamentary dissents and the pamphlets and the women's health journals. They are there in the woman on Kingsland Road, whose name is not recorded but whose work is legible in the fact that Jane Martin survived to write anything at all. History is not inevitable. What changes? Changes because people fight for it, usually for a very long time, in the face of laws and institutions and moral frameworks that are not yet ready to change. This is one of those fights. It is not over in 1878. It is barely begun, but it is begun. Now, let me take you to another room. Not your room in Bermondsey, a different room entirely. 18 months earlier, 1876, a house in Cavendish Square, which is not Bermondsey and is not Kensington either. It is the specific part of London that exists between those two worlds, the respectable professional middle class, lawyers and surgeons and professors and their families, manage prosperity, moderate ambition, appropriate furniture. Dr. Edmund Fraser is a physician with a practice in Cavendish Square. He is 44 years old. He has been in practice for 15 years. He delivers babies and attends fevers and manages chronic conditions and does the general work of a general practitioner in a reasonably prosperous part of London. He is not Dr. Hargreaves. He does not, as a matter of practice, help women end pregnancies. He has been asked, over the course of 15 years, perhaps a dozen times, by women who knew or suspected or hoped that he might be the kind of doctor who would help them. He has said no, gently and with what he believes is genuine sympathy. Each time. He has said no because the law says no. He has said no because the Royal College of Physicians takes a clear position on the matter. He has said no because he is a man who follows the rules of his profession and his society, not out of rigidity or lack of imagination, but out of genuine belief that the rules exist for reasons and that one maintains them even when individual cases create discomfort. He has said no. On a Tuesday in November 1876, a woman is brought to his surgery by her husband. She is by the time she arrives very ill. Her name is Margaret Fletcher. She's 31 years old. She's been bleeding seriously and continuously for 48 hours. She is pale in the way that people are pale when they have lost significant blood, a kind of translucency, the skin no longer quite containing what it should contain. Her pulse is rapid and weak. She can barely stand. Her husband, a textile merchant named Frederick Fletcher, is frightened in the particular way of men who are frightened by things that have gone wrong inside the bodies of women they are responsible for, a kind of frightened helplessness combined with an insistence on being helpful that expresses itself as hovering and repeating questions the doctor has not yet answered. Dr. Fraser sends him to wait in the outer room. He examines Mrs. Fletcher. He knows within a few minutes what has happened. He has seen this before, not often, but enough. The presentation is not ambiguous. She has attempted, or someone has attempted for her, to end a pregnancy, and the attempt has resulted in an incomplete outcome and subsequent hemorrhage that has been going on too long. She's conscious, she's coherent, though exhausted by blood loss. She answers his questions after a moment of the hesitation that he recognizes the moment where a woman decides whether to trust the person asking. She tells him what happened. Not in detail, but in enough. She was 9 weeks along. She'd gone to a woman, she gives no name. She will give no name, somewhere in the 7 Dials. Something went wrong. She'd been hoping the bleeding would stop on its own. He does not ask about the woman in the 7 Dials. He does not need to know. He needs to manage what is in front of him, which is a woman who is losing blood faster than she can afford to, and who is beginning, in addition to the hemorrhage, to show signs of fever, which is not a good sign, which is in fact a sign that requires urgent action. He does what he can with what he has. He manages the hemorrhage, he addresses the fever, he keeps her in his surgery overnight, his housekeeper serving as attendant, and he checks on her 3 times through the night. She survives. It is not certain that she will, not for the first day, not until the fever breaks and the bleeding stops and the body's own tenacity asserts itself, but she survives. When she's well enough to speak to him coherently on the 3rd day, he sits beside her in the small room where she has been recovering, and he does something he has not done in 15 years of practice. He asks her, not as a physician gathering clinical information, but as a person asking another person a question, why she did not come to him first. She looks at him. She has the particular look of a woman who's been through something significant and has emerged from it into a clarity she did not have before. Because, she says, she knew he would say no. He's quiet for a moment. She's right. He would have said no. He would have said no for all the reasons he has said no before, and she would have gone to the 7 Dials, and she would have ended up here, in this room, fighting for her life, and the outcome, not quite a tragedy but very close to one, would have been the same. She is right. He doesn't say that. He sees something careful and professional. He says that she must rest, and that the law is what the law is, and that he hopes she understands the seriousness of what has happened, and that she will be more careful in the future. He says all the things that his profession and his society provide him with to say in this situation. She listens politely. She's 31 years old, and she's been through 48 hours of hemorrhage and fever, and she has survived, and she's listening politely to a man who is telling her to be more careful. She says when he finishes, "Yes, doctor. Thank you, doctor. I will." She recovers fully. She leaves the surgery on the 5th day. Dr. Fraser files no report. He is not legally required to file a report when no death has occurred and when the patient has declined to name anyone. The obligation to report exists primarily in relation to suspicious deaths. He treats her as what she technically is, a woman who has been ill with a condition that required treatment. He adds nothing to the case notes beyond the clinical details. He does not change his practice of saying no. But the case stays with him. He thinks about it at intervals for years afterward. Not about her specifically, though he thinks about her too. This woman with her quiet clarity and her polite thank you. He thinks about the structure of it. The structure in which no was his answer, and the 7 Dials was her next step, and the room in his surgery was the unavoidable consequence. He never writes about it. His case notes are clinical and correct. He is a man of his time, thoroughly embedded in its assumptions, genuinely committed to its values, and also in that private Wednesday night space where honest men think about what they have seen, troubled by what those values produce. There's a very large number of Edmund Frasers in Victorian England, men who are not cruel, not stupid, not even entirely without sympathy, who maintain prohibitions that they have begun, in private, to question, and who will not act on that questioning because the social and professional cost of acting on it is too high. This is not a flattering portrait, but it is an accurate one. Most of the people who produce historical injustice are not monsters. They are people like Dr. Fraser, well-intentioned, privately uncertain, ultimately compliant. The monsters are less interesting historically than the Dr. Frasers. The monsters are rare. The Dr. Frasers are the mechanism. Back to the old Kent Road. Not to Mrs. Garvey's court specifically. To a court 2 streets over, which is a different court in every particular, except that it is also a place where women come on certain mornings of the week. The woman who operates from this court is not Mrs. Garvey. She is younger, 38, and her name is Alice Sutton, and she has not been doing this for 30 years, but for 4, which is long enough to have learned certain things, and not long enough to have learned other things, and this distinction will matter. Alice Sutton came to this work the way many women came to it, through necessity that preceded choice. She had been a factory hand, then a laundress who helped a neighbour, and then another neighbour, and then women who were not neighbours but had heard she might help. And now she is someone women find their way to, through the same whisper network that led you to Mrs. Garvey, except that the network that leads to Alice Sutton is a different strand of the same web, and it has not been as carefully verified. Alice Sutton does not have a spirit lamp. She is not, shall we say, operating to the standard that Mrs. Garvey has developed over 30 years of practice. This is not her fault exactly. She is trying to help. She charges less than Mrs. Garvey because she knows less, or rather she charges less because she has not established the reputation that would allow her to charge more, and this makes her accessible to women who cannot afford even Mrs. Garvey's modest fees. She is filling a gap that exists because the gap has always existed, and will continue to exist as long as the conditions that produce it persist. But in April of 1878, a woman named Agnes Turner comes to Alice Sutton's court. Agnes is 23 years old. She's 8 weeks pregnant. She pays 1 shilling and 6pence, which is what she has. She goes home to her rooms in Deptford. She develops a fever on the 2nd day. By the 4th day, the fever is very high, and her husband, terrified, brings her to Guy's Hospital. She dies on the 6th day. The doctors at Guy's write in their notes, admitted in a state of advanced septic infection following what appears to have been criminal interference. A magistrate comes. Agnes Turner is not conscious. She dies before any declaration can be taken. The inquiry that follows leads eventually to Alice Sutton, one of the women who has been to her talks, not to the police deliberately, but in the hearing of someone who does talk to the police, and the chain of information reaches the right ears, and Alice Sutton is investigated and arrested in May 1878. She is tried in July 1878. She is convicted. She is sentenced to 3 years hard labour. In the same month, Dr. Hargreaves, in his Mayfair consulting rooms, attends his 14th patient of the year in similar circumstances. She is the daughter of a baronet. The fee is 6 guineas. She recovers without complication. Dr. Hargreaves is not investigated. This is not an accident. This is not a coincidence. This is how the law worked. The summer of 1878 is hot. London summers have a particular quality that winter does not. The smell intensifies. The drains, which are better now than they were before the great stink of 1858, forced the construction of Bazalgette's sewer system, are still not good enough. The river is lower and slower in the heat, and it smells of everything the city deposits in it. The courts and alleys of Bermondsey, which face south and collect the afternoon sun on their stone walls, trap the heat and concentrate the smells, and by July the combination of coal smoke and drains and bodies and the particular organic warmth of too many people in too small a space is something you have to pass through rather than breathe. You've been at the collar work since before the sun was up. The light is better in the early morning, before the heat makes the air hazy, and you have learned to do the finest work in those first hours when your eyes are fresh and the thread runs smooth. Annie is at school. This is new since March. A church school 2 streets over that takes children from 6 upward, penny a week, which you can manage in most weeks, and in the weeks you cannot, Annie goes anyway and you settle a penny the following week. The school is not remarkable. The teaching is not inspired. But Annie is learning to read properly and to do figures, and she comes home and tells you things she has learned very seriously, as though the information is a gift she has assembled and is now presenting. Robbie is on the landing with the boy from downstairs, playing something that involves a great deal of clattering. James is at the docks. You are at the collars. This is your life. It is not a life that anyone would write a novel about, in the Victorian literary tradition that deals primarily with the moral educations of young people with enough money and leisure to be morally educated. It is a life that passes unrecorded except in the census returns, which note your name and your husband's occupation, and the names and ages of your children, and in the records of the collar manufacturer who takes your work, where you're a quantity of output per week, and nothing else. It is also a life that is continuing. That is not, in 1878, a small thing. Let me tell you now about what happens to the women who do not survive. Not the immediate deaths. I have told you about those, or some of them. The hospital admissions. The women who came in too late with too much fever. I want to tell you about a different kind of not surviving. The longer, slower kind. A woman named Emma Royce, in Whitechapel, 1882. She's 35 years old. She has had 5 children, 3 of whom have survived to adulthood. In 1882, she is pregnant with what would be her 6th, and she calculates she simply cannot have another child. She does not know Mrs. Garvey. The woman she finds, through her own version of the Whisper Network, is less careful than Mrs. Garvey, though more careful than Alice Sutton, a middle ground of risk that is the characteristic position of most of the women in this network. She does not die. She does not go to hospital. But something has been damaged that the procedure of 1882 and her body's subsequent attempts to heal cannot entirely repair, and she suffers from what the medical language of the time would call chronic pelvic inflammation, and what we might recognize as the long-term effects of an infection that was treated with rest and time rather than with the antibiotics that do not yet exist. She is in some degree of pain, more or less for the rest of her life, not agony, not incapacity, but a background of discomfort that she manages with the particular stoicism of women who have been managing physical difficulty their entire lives and who do not have the luxury of not managing it. She tells no one except her sister, once, after several years have passed and the danger of any legal consequence has receded into abstraction. Her sister understands without asking further questions. Emma Royce lives to 71. She works until she is 63. She sees her 3 surviving children grow up and marry and have children of their own. She is, by any external measure, a woman who lived a full life by the standards of her time and class. And she is in pain, quietly, most of the time. And the pain is the consequence of a choice she made in 1882 that she would, if you asked her, make again, and that she made in the only way it was available to be made, which was the way that produced the pain. This is also the history. The women who did not die. The women who survived with costs that were never counted, because the counting would have required acknowledging the conditions that made the costs necessary. The autumn of 1878. The new penny school is teaching Annie multiplication. She comes home and explains it to you while you're cooking, which is an explanation you do not need, having managed the multiplication of shillings and pennies and dozens of collar work for as long as you have been adult. But you listen as though it is new information, and it partly is, because the way Annie explains things is its own kind of information, tells you something about the quality of her thinking, the way her mind assembles and presents what it knows. She will be 8 in December. You've been putting away pennies more carefully than usual in the coat lining, not for an emergency this time, for a different kind of investment. There is a haberdashery on the Borough High Street that sometimes takes a girl on as a counter assistant starting at 12 years old. The woman who runs it, Mrs. Atkins, is known to Mrs. Partridge as a fair employer. Fair meaning she pays what she says she will pay, which is not universal, and she does not make the girls do things that are not in their agreed work, which is also not universal, and she has had girls who have worked for her and gone on to be assistants in better shops and eventually shop managers, which is a trajectory that is, for a girl like Annie, a kind of upper boundary of aspiration, and it is not nothing. 4 more years. Annie at 12. You stitch. The winter comes. The water in the basin is frozen again. You break it with your fist. Now. Let me go to one more room. One more woman. Because the history does not belong only to the women who sought help, or only to the women who provided it. It also belongs to the women who watched and recorded, who existed in the professional margins, who had access to the information but not always the ability to act on it. A woman named Frances Hoggan obtained a medical degree in Zurich in 1870 because British medical schools did not admit women. She returned to London and practiced medicine, despite the significant institutional resistance to women in medicine that the period maintained. And she wrote, in the 1870s and early 1880s, on the relationship between women's health and social conditions. She wrote about what she called the cruel paradox of the law as it applied to reproduction, that the law criminalized the response to a problem while doing nothing to address the problem, and that the women who suffered the consequences of this paradox were, without exception, the women who could least afford to suffer additional consequences. She did not use the word abortion. She used the language of the time. She wrote about the resort to criminal means which desperation makes inevitable. She wrote about the conditions of poverty that make such desperation endemic. She wrote about the inadequacy of the charitable and legal mechanisms available to women whose economic circumstances produce the situation to which criminal means are the only available response. She was writing these things in medical journals with limited circulation, addressing an audience of professionals, most of whom were men who had not thought about the question in quite this way before, and were not necessarily inclined to start. Her work did not change anything immediately. Her work, along with the work of other women doctors of the period, Mary Putnam Jacobi, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, created a body of argument that was available to be cited and built on when the political moment arrived to build on it. The political moment did not arrive in 1878. It had not arrived by the time Frances Hoggan died in 1927. But the work she did in those years was part of the structure that eventually supported something that did change things. This is how history works, most of the time. Not in a single event or decision, but in the slow accumulation of arguments and evidence and testimony, and the gradual shift of what a society is willing to consider possible. The women in the back rooms did not wait for the political moment. They could not. They were doing the arithmetic now. They were managing the impossible now. They were making choices and taking risks and helping each other through the quiet networks of women who trusted other women with what they could not trust anyone else with. And those choices and those risks and those networks are also part of the structure. They are also part of what eventually made the argument possible that the law was producing more suffering than it was preventing. They are the evidence base, written in the bodies of women who survived and the bodies of women who did not, for the arguments that Frances Hoggan and her colleagues were making in the medical journals. The women in the back rooms and the women writing in the journals are part of the same history. They just inhabited very different rooms. The spring of 1879. You've been saving for 6 months in the coat lining. James has been, for the last 3 months, reliably at the docks, which is the longest reliable stretch since Robbie was born, and you do not ask what has changed, because asking would require acknowledging that it might change back, and acknowledging that seems like it might make it more likely to change back, which is superstition, but which is also the kind of superstition that is forgivable when your grip on stability is as precarious as yours. Annie is 8. She's reading now things she has not been given at school, things she finds at the penny lending library on the corner, history books, geography, a natural history of birds that she has brought home 3 times and returned and brought home again. She reads with the specific intensity of someone for whom reading is not a performance of learning, but an actual encounter with a world that is larger than the world she is standing in. And she reads like she is memorizing, and you watch her sometimes when she does not know you're watching, and you think, there it is. There is what I am keeping the arithmetic right for. Mrs. Garvey, on the Old Kent Road, has a new woman come to her on a Thursday morning in April. Her name you do not know and will not know. Mrs. Garvey does not share names. That is part of what makes her trustworthy. The woman is 7 weeks along. She is frightened. She has come from Walworth, which is a walk of about 30 minutes, and she has told her husband she's going to visit her sister. She does not have a sister, not in London. Mrs. Garvey makes her tea and asks her questions, and she answers, and then she goes through to the back room. The spirit lamp is warm, the floor has been scrubbed. This is, in the arithmetic of 1879, the best you can do. This is what is available. It is not what should be available. It is not safe, not really. Not by any standard that honest accounting would accept as safe. But it is safer than the alternatives that exist in this actual world. And the woman from Walworth needs something that exists in this actual world, and so she is here, in this room, with these hands, and this will have to do. It does. She walks home through April London, through the particular quality of April light that makes even Walworth look slightly more hopeful than it did in March, and the cramps begin on the walk and continue through the evening, and by the following morning it is done, and she has not told anyone except the women she had to tell to find Mrs. Garvey, and those women will not tell anyone, and the network holds. The network holds. This is the thing that surprises, or should surprise, about this history, how effectively women kept these secrets, given the legal stakes, given the social stakes, given the absolute catastrophic potential of any information getting to anyone who was not already in the network. Women came to Mrs. Garvey, and women like Mrs. Garvey, thousands of them over the decades, and in the vast majority of cases nothing leaked. Not because Victorian women were unusually discreet, but because they understood with absolute clarity what disclosure would mean for themselves, for the women who helped them, for every woman who came after them and would need to use the same network. The network's security was not accidental. It was maintained by the collective understanding of everyone in it that its security was all of their security, and that this understanding was non-negotiable. Women kept each other's secrets. They did this routinely, continuously, at enormous personal and legal risk for generations, because it was the only protection any of them had. This is also the history. Now we're coming toward the end of our time together, and I want to bring you back to a specific moment, a specific room, before we let the night do what it does and carry you towards sleep. It is December 1878, a cold one. The water in the basin is frozen by 4 in the morning, and you've given up trying to keep the coal burning through the night, because the coal costs money, and the blanket, if you add James's warmth, and the children piled in beside you on the very cold nights, is adequate. Annie's birthday is the 17th. She is 8 years old. You have made her something. Not bought, because buying was not possible, but made. A small cloth doll, fashioned from scraps of the collar fabric, with button eyes from the sewing box and hair made from lengths of brown wool. It is not elaborate. It is, by the standards of what you have available, as good as you can do. She opens it on the morning of the 17th, and she holds it, and she looks at it, and she looks at you, and she does not say what 8-year-olds usually say about gifts, which is, "Thank you," or, because she is Annie and she always says the specific thing rather than the expected one, she says, "Did you make it?" "Yes," you say. She turns it over. She looks at the seams, which are neat because you are a woman who does piecework and your seams are always neat. She looks at the button eyes. "It's very well made," she says, very seriously. The way she says things. You have to look away for a moment at the window, at the cold December street outside, at the world being ordinary and grey and continuing, because otherwise you're going to cry in front of your 8-year-old on her birthday, and that is not the thing you want to do. You look back. "Thank you," she says formally, like she's completing a transaction she has thought about. "You're welcome," you say. She carries the doll to the table and sits it in a chair carefully, and then she sits across from it and looks at it for a moment, and then she picks up her reading. The day continues. The collar work continues. The arithmetic continues. The city outside the window continues in all its unremarkable vastness. 34 miles of streets and 3.5 million lives, each one its own arithmetic, its own series of calculations that have to come out right. You stitch. In Mrs. Garvey's court off the Old Kent Road it is quiet today. No one has come this morning. She's at her plain sewing in the front room, sitting in the chair by the window where the light is best. Her glasses on for close work, the particular silence of a woman managing solitude with the habits of industry. She is 63 years old. She's been doing this work for 32 years. She has helped more women than she has counted, which is deliberate. She does not count because counting would make it into something different, would give it a weight and a size that are harder to carry than the individual acts, one woman at a time, one Thursday morning at a time. She has a small bowl of forced bulbs on the windowsill purchased from the market stall, paper whites, their green spears just visible. In 3 weeks they will flower. She sews, the network holds, the night is coming. In this city, in this year, in these rooms the night is always coming, and it brings with it the particular stillness that follows after the children are in bed, and James is wherever James is, and the collar work is folded for tomorrow, and the fire is low, and there is nothing left to do but lie down. You're very tired. The arithmetic is not solved. It never is, not permanently, not in the way you would want it solved, which is by some transformation of the conditions rather than by the management of their consequences. The numbers will need to be done again tomorrow. The pennies will need to be stretched again. The coat lining will need to be checked and the doctor's penny put aside if possible, and the shoes will need to be resolved by the time autumn comes again. This is not a life that permits extended rest. But tonight you are warm enough, you are fed enough. The children are breathing softly in the way that sleeping children breathe, which is the most reassuring sound in the world, and has been probably since the first humans lay down in the dark and listened for it. You close your eyes. The city moves outside. It is always moving. The night watchmen make their rounds. The drunks make their rounds. Somewhere, a woman is in a room that she needs to leave. Somewhere, another woman is thinking about what options she has, counting them the way you count pennies, finding them fewer than she needs. And somewhere, in a court off the old Kent Road, in a clean room with a spirit lamp and a scrubbed floor, the network holds. It holds. The windows of the tenement are dark, one by one, as the candles go out. The street below is quiet. The cold presses against the glass. The blanket is thin but adequate. James's arm is across the mattress. You have learned to sleep around it. You are sleeping now. The weight of the day is lifting. The collar work and the arithmetic and the coat lining and December and the doll and Annie's face when she said it's very well made, very seriously. All of it is lifting, becoming something gentler than itself, becoming the texture of a life that is still going, still in motion. The city breathes around you. 1,000,000 lives, 1,000,000 calculations, 1,000,000 women doing the arithmetic of what is possible, what is survivable, what it means to keep going in the world as it actually is rather than in the world that the men who make the laws believe they are legislating for. You have done the arithmetic. You're still here. That is not nothing. That is in 1878 in Bermondsey, in these rooms with these children, with this particular set of numbers that never quite come out the way you need them to. Everything. Let it settle now. Let the numbers quiet. The collars will be there tomorrow. The pennies will need counting. Annie will read, and Robbie will eat, and James will either go to the docks or he will not, and you will manage whichever of those is true. But that is tomorrow. Right now, there is only this: the dark room, the slow breathing, the warmth of what warmth there is, the city outside enormous and indifferent and full of women keeping each other's secrets. Centuries will pass, the rooms will change, the laws will change eventually after a very long time and a great deal of fighting by women whose names you will never know and who will never know yours. The arithmetic will change, though it will never quite solve itself, because the arithmetic is always harder for some people than for others, and that particular mathematics seems to be built into the structure of the world. But the impulse that brought you to Mrs. Garvey's court, the impulse that made Mrs. Garvey scrub her floor and heat her instruments and say, "You must come back to me if the fever starts," the impulse that made Jane Martin write her letter and Annie Besant stand trial for a pamphlet, and Frances Hoggan write in medical journals that men were not entirely ready to read. The impulse that made women keep each other's secrets across generations, in the particular understanding that secrecy was solidarity, and solidarity was survival. That doesn't change. The human heart doesn't change. The network holds. Let sleep take you the way it took the women in those rooms. the women you have been tonight, the women who kept going in the face of what they faced, with their arithmetic and their coats and their pennies and their daughters who could read. Let the world go quiet. Let it all slow down. You have earned this rest. Take it. Good night.